Welcome back once again to your class on Bible Survey 1 or Old Testament Survey. So let us proceed and let us go further into the last section of the book or of the course, that is on the minor prophets. So let us continue. Let me start sharing the screen. Okay, as you can see, we are entering into the last or the 18th chapter. So this chapter I have divided into three parts. This chapter I've divided into three parts. So we'll be serving the books, the 12 books of the minor prophets in three parts. Okay, so for this class, we are going to deal with the books of Amos, Hosea, Micah, and Jonah. So let us begin. Let us start with the first section or the first chapter or the first part of the minor prophets. So let us first introduce about the minor prophets. Okay, so minor, as we have already seen the distinction between the minor and the major prophets, when we had already started with the prophetical books, nonetheless, we'll look little further into it and we'll talk about the minor prophets first, and then we will look into the various books in a survey manner. Okay, so the prophetical books are divided into two sections as we have already seen, the major and the minor prophets. The term major and minor, as we have already told, is based on the length of the books and not on the importance or the significance of the book. So you have to be very careful in understanding that we call the four books or the three books, that is Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and also we include sometimes Daniel. These books are called the major prophets because of the length of the book, and the rest of the 12 books are called the minor prophets because they are shorter in length. So there is no difference between the importance of the call of the prophets or the ministry of the prophets or the place of where the prophets ministered or the message where they ministered, because in the sight of God, all the calls are equal and equally important. Okay, so even the smallest ministerial thing that you do for God is equally important for God, and that is why there is no comparison in the kingdom of God on the basis of ministry. Okay, so the major prophets are called major prophets because the books are lengthier, they are longer, and the minor prophets are called minor prophets because their books are shorter in length. So the minor prophets are therefore shorter books from Joel to Malachi, and and they were all actually a part of one scroll in the Hebrew scriptures or the Hebrew scripture, or as we can say the Hebrew the holy script or the sacred scriptures, the books that we had. So the minor prophets were 12 books and they were part of one scroll, and it was called the Book of the 12, and they belong to the Nebiim section. Okay, they covered a period of several centuries from 750 BC to 300 BC during the reigns of Assyria, Babylon, and Persian empires. So some of the prophets ministered during the pre-exilic period, some ministered during the exilic period, and some also ministered during the post-exilic period. So their ministry is scattered all over through many centuries. Okay, so from 750 to 300 BC. So there were minor prophets before the exile, there were minor prophets during the exile, and there were also minor prophets after the exile. So the section of the minor prophets is basically not arranged chronologically. There is no arrangement of chronological arrangement of the books in our Bible. But if you go to see according to their ministry and the time of ministry, some of the books seem to be arranged in or placed in a proper place. Otherwise, the rest of the books are not placed chronologically. So some books like Amos and Hosea, they are pre-exilic prophets, and they are put right in the beginning of the minor prophetic section. So they are in the right positions. Then we have other books like Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. They are situated towards the end of the minor prophets, and they also seem to be in the right place. The rest of the books are placed without any chronology. Okay, so the books of the minor prophets can be basically divided into four sections, and these sections are based on the periods of their ministry in the history of Israel. So it's not about how important a prophet was, or it was not about how the place or any or alphabetical order, but it is according to the era or the time period that they were ministering in. Okay, so accordingly, we can divide them into four sections. So there are 8th century prophets, 7th century prophets, prophets of the exile, and post-exilic prophets. So the 8th century prophets were Amos, Hosea, Micah, and Jonah. Then the 7th century prophets were Nahum, Habakkuk, and Zephaniah. And then the prophets of exile were Obadiah. And then we have the post-exilic prophets, that is Haggai, Zechariah, Joel, and Malachi. So we are going to study the prophets in the same order that we have them right here before us. Okay. So let's begin with the 8th century. So let's look at the background, historical background of the 8th century first, and then we will jump into the first 4 prophets that we're going to talk about. Okay, so let's look at the historical background or the political background of 8th century. So externally, if we can say, at the beginning of the 8th century, Israel had become invincible in their power. Actually, they had become the kings of that time. The Israel kingdom had become a kingdom that was invincible, which means which cannot be defeated. You cannot war against them. So they had become so powerful and they were so invincible when looked from outside. And there was a lot of peace and prosperity both in Israel and in Judah at that time. So 8th century was a time of peace, actually a time of peace and prosperity both for Israel and for Judah. Especially in the initial years where David till Solomon, we can say there was a lot of peace and a lot of prosperity, and they had expanded greatly during their reign. But internally, okay, this was a picture from outside that they were looking very prosperous and they were looking very peaceful from outside. But internally, if you go to see internally, there were a lot of conflicts in the sense that during the reigns of the kings, the nobles and the rich people were becoming richer and wealthier, more and more wealthier. And that was actually at the cost of the poor and the marginalized. So we can see that the rich were becoming rich and the noble people were becoming more richer and more nobler and more wealthier because they were exploiting the poor and the marginalized. So the poor were becoming more and more poor and the rich were becoming more and more richer. So the gap between the rich and the poor was widening instead of reducing as God wanted in his kingdom, according to the laws that he had given. But we see that the rich were becoming richer and the poor were becoming poorer. And this was at the cost of exploitation and corruption. So the poor were exploited and whatever they had, it was also taken away from them. Okay. Then we see that the prophets like Amos and Hosea condemned this kind of life and injustice and the kind of false worship that was taking place in these periods. And they warned the kings and the people that the judgment is going to come. There is an impending judgment. That is, the God is going to judge them very soon if they do not turn away from their unjust ways and do not turn away from the false worship of gods and goddesses. So gradually, the new and the powerful kings took up the thrones in the external part of Israel. That is, in Assyria. Assyria started becoming more and more powerful, and they started conquering more and more regions. And gradually, we see that the Assyrians gradually conquer the northern part of Israel. That is, the 10 tribes of Israel, and they take them into exile. And this ends the story of the northern kingdom. But we see that Judah stood at that time, and because they had already been divided into northern and the southern kingdom, and the different kings were ruling them. So Judah stood by that time because it was lesser evil kingdom in the sight of God. So God gave them more time. So Judah stood alone at that time, and it actually submitted to the Assyrian powers at that time. But it also rebelled against the Assyrian kingdom quite a number of times with taking Egyptian help. So they were depending on Egypt for their strength, and they allied with the Egyptians, and they depended and they joined hands with them, and they tried to rebel and revolt against the Assyrian kingdom, which was harmful for them actually. There was only one time when, at the time of Sennacherib, we see where Hezekiah's time, where we see that Judah was able to defeat Assyrian kingdom. Otherwise, it had to submit to it and pay their all their gifts and offerings and everything to the kingdom of Assyria. So at that time, we also see that Isaiah also urged the people at that time to put their trust in God instead of depending on their allies. So there was a lot of things happening in the social political background of Israel at that time. So there were three main important things that were taking place, and these were the three strands about which the prophets or the minor prophets of the 8th century, and actually later on also they were prophesying and speaking about. So they spoke about the social sins. The social sins consisted of the injustice to the poor, which was abhorring in the sight of God. The second was political sins, that was alliance with foreign powers. Instead of depending on and trusting on God, they were depending and trusting on the foreign powers to gain victory over the external kingdoms. And then we had the religious sins of apostasy and idolatry. So these were the three strands against which or about which the prophets were prophesying: the social sins, the political sins, and the religious sins. Okay, this takes us to the first book of the minor prophets, that is Amos. So we'll talk about or survey the book of Amos in a few minutes. Okay, so let's look about the book of Amos. He was first among all the classical prophets whose words have been recorded, and probably he ranks first among the greatest or the greatest among the minor prophets. Probably that was the reason why he was placed first, but we do not know. Okay, so his book is very profound. He is the first among all the minor prophets whose words have been written. Okay, whose word? So this is the first book that was written down among all the minor prophets. So that is what's considered to be so important. So he belonged to Tekoa, which is nearly 12 miles from the south of Jerusalem to the edge of the Judean desert. Okay, so he belongs to the southern part of the Israel. So the time of his ministry was during the reigns of King Uzziah in Judah and King Jeroboam in Israel. So this was a time, as we can see it in Amos chapter 1, verse 1. So Uzziah was reigning in the southern kingdom, and Jeroboam was reigning in the northern kingdom. This is the initial days, as we can say, after the split took place. So then we can see that his book can be placed around 755 BC. This was approximate period where we can place his book. So the place of his ministry was Israel. Okay, so place of his ministry was Israel. So he was a layman. Okay, he was a common man. He was a commoner. That's what he likes to be called. He does not likes to be called a prophet. So he was a layman, a commoner from the southern kingdom. He had two occupations. He was a shepherd or a herdsman, taking care of sheep and the flock. And then secondly, he was also a farmer and a dresser of a sycamore fig tree. So he used to have a plantations of sycamore fig tree. So he used to take that and sell it also. So he was basically a farmer and also a shepherd. So the farming was seasonal, as we all know that the fig did not grow in all the seasons. So, but shepherding was all season. Okay, so it is said that he used to go to Bethel and the northern kingdom to sell his agricultural produce. And it is also assumed, or it is also said by the scholars, that in one of his trips when he went to Bethel, he was seeing all this corruption and he was seeing all these bad things that were happening in the northern kingdom. So he had gone to sell his agricultural produce over there. And this was a time when God called him to be a prophet or the messenger of his word. And he also gave him the visions and the oracles at that time. Hence, we can see that God sent him from the southern kingdom to the northern kingdom. So he's a missionary from the southern kingdom to the northern kingdom, and God sent him to condemn the social and the religious corruption and to warn the people of the impending judgment from God. He refused to be called a prophet or a seer because because it was actually the prophets of that time or the seers at that time had a horrible or a bad reputation at that time, because they were professional prophets at that time, and they used to do prophesy or say false things to earn money. So there were prophets and the shrines around the shrines of Bethel also, and there were bands of professional prophets who used to take money, cash, and kind and prophesy, and they would say positive things only, and they were not true messengers from God. So they were known as prophets in those days. That is why Amos did not like to be called a prophet. So he said, I am a layman called by God. That's what he says. Okay, so he does not like to be called a prophet or a seer. So many commentators, as we can see, they say that when he actually went to Bethel, that was a time when God called him and he received all the visions and that experience of to be a prophet. So it is mentioned in chapter 7 to 9, as we can say about his experience or his call. Okay, so the genuine marks of a true prophet are also seen in him clearly, according to the ministry that he does and according to the words that he speaks, according to the you can say that confidence and boldness that he has, authority that he has with which he speaks, we can definitely note that he has the genuine marks of a true prophet. Then we can see that he had an excellent understanding of holiness and justice. He knew right from wrong. He knew that this is wrong. He knew this is holy. He knew this is unholy. He knew this is right. He knew this is wrong. So he was very clear in his thought pattern, and he was not confused at all. And that was something that should make him stand differently from the other crowds of people or the other prophets. So he could easily comprehend God's hand in the course of history of the nation. So he had a good knowledge of the history of past and what is happening to the nations. So he could see clearly that this is the hand of God, this is the work of God, and he was able. He spoke about it also, and he easily could see the stark differences between the condition of the northern kingdom under the evil king of Jeroboam and the southern kingdom under the godly king of Hosea. So he had a clear distinction. He could make, he had a clear vision, he had a clear sight, and he could clear understanding, and he could clearly differentiate between the kind of rule that was happening in the northern kingdom under Jeroboam and the southern kingdom under Hosea, a godly king Hosea. So he could differentiate how God is working to the southern kingdom and how God is angry with the northern kingdom. So this is something about the book of Amos, and we see that he's basically talking about the holiness, about justice, and about the impending judgment of God if they do not turn away from their evil ways. So let's look into the division of the book. The book can be divided actually into 8 parts, depending on the oracles and the 5 symbolic visions that Amos had received from God. So Amos chapters 1, verse 3 to chapter 2, verse 16, we have the oracles against the nations, that is 8 nations: Damascus, Gaza, Tyre, Edom, Ammon, Moab, Judah, and Israel. So he emphasizes, or he spends more time when he's talking about Judah and then about Israel. Then we have Amos chapter 3, verse 1 to 6, verse 14. We have oracles against Israel in this. Okay, so this is the main emphasis and focus of Amos on the oracles against Israel and its sins. Then we have Amos chapter 7, verse 1 to verse 89. Verse 89. Here we have 3 visions. Okay, here we have 3 visions: the vision of locust, the vision of fire, and the vision of plumb land. Then we have chapter 7 to verse 10 to chapter 17. Verse 17. Here we have an encounter with Amaziah, who was a false prophet, who asked him to go back to his own place. Okay, if you read that portion. Then we have Amos chapter 8, verses 1 to 3. We have the 4th vision over there. This vision is about the basket full of ripe fruits, where he said the sin is ripe and now it is a time for God to judge. So Amos chapter 8, verse 4 to 14, we have 4 oracles mentioned in verses 4 to 6, 7 to 8, 9 to 10, and 11 to 14. And then we have Amos chapter 9, verse 1, the 5th vision, that is Lord standing at the altar. This is the last vision that he had received. Okay, and then we have the last part, that is chapter 9, verse 2 to 15. Here we have theology of creation and redemption. Okay, so this is about the book of Amos. Okay, so let's move ahead and let's talk about the book of Hosea. Hosea, we have probably we have all read and we have loved this book. So Hosea was a contemporary of Amos and Isaiah as a prophet of the 8th century. So he prophesied during the reign of the last powerful king Jeroboam II. The book condemns Israel for her unfaithfulness to Jehovah, as is seen in the biography, in his own biography, of marrying a woman who turns out to be unfaithful wife and a prostitute. Okay, so we have to understand that this book is basically based on the life story of Hosea, and God uses the story of Hosea. He asks him to marry a woman, and that woman later on who turns out to be unfaithful and a prostitute, just as Israel also, whom God chose and called and married, as he says, as his wife, and then he becomes her husband and takes care of Israel. and then Israel becomes unfaithful, turns to other gods and goddesses, and then also prostitutes herself to other gods and goddesses. So this is the story of Hosea, and it is we can say it's a parable. It's kind of parable. It's kind of example that God brings forth a true life story, which is signifies the relationship between God and His people. So scholars basically interpret this story in two ways. It is considered to be a true account of the prophet's life. Okay, firstly, many scholars assume that or consider it to be a true account of prophet's life, which he can relate with the unfaithfulness of Israel towards God, and then God condemns them. Okay. And the second is it is a symbolic parable, and they say that this is not a true story, but it is just a parable, and it is used by God to talk to Israel. Okay, so this is the two views that the scholars have about the book of Hosea. Hosea's main message is kesed or covenantal love. Okay, kesed or covenantal love of Yahweh for Israel. Okay, so it's God loves Israel, and this is selfless love. This is the covenantal love, which is called kesed love. The kindness of God, the tender kindness of God and grace of God towards Israel. So, and to call them, this is like he wants to call them back, and he wants them to respond to him in gratitude, and he wants them to turn away from their unfaithfulness. And then we see that his emphasis is therefore based on the special preferential love and the divine grace of God for his people. So he wants to tell the people that they are important for God, and he loves them a lot, and his divine grace is upon them, and his special care is upon them, and he wants them to turn back towards his grace. So, due to this emphasis on the Kesed love, Hosea is also called the prophet of love. Just as we see that John is also called the apostle of love, Hosea is also called the prophet of love, because both of them are talking about God's love for his people. It is difficult to date this writing. We do not know when this book was written. But Hosea 1:1, it states that he ministered. The period of his ministry was somewhere between Uzziah to King Hezekiah. Okay, so he ministered during that time. So probably his ministry was a quite long ministry. His whole life was ministry actually. So it was probably over half a century, that is 50 years. So we see that he probably penned down his own experience around 750 BC to 725 BC. But there is, but we can see as there is no mention of the captivity of Samaria. So it is somewhere between before the captivity of Samaria. So we have to end it before 722 BC because it is not mentioned in the book. So he is a native of the northern kingdom. He belonged to Israel, and he could have grown up around Samaria because this is the place where he preached. Okay, some scholars also suggest that he belonged to the priestly family. But now the problem is belonging to the priestly family of the northern kingdom can be a little problematic because they were no true worshippers or no true priests, and they were worshipping gods and goddesses, other gods and goddesses. But definitely, if he was a priest, he belonged to a priestly family, it could have been from the southern kingdom, the a family of a southern kingdom. Otherwise, it's not possible because the northern kingdom priests all were perverted. Okay, so if he belongs to a priestly family, it has to be from the southern kingdom, living in the northern kingdom. So even if he was a priest, we can say that he belonged to God in the Jerusalem, priests of God in the Jerusalem temple. So he was well acquainted with the history of Israel and also with the current condition. It's not only about the law or the history of Israel, but he was also updated with the current conditions of Israel at that time. So God used him with the knowledge that he had to lead the people towards salvation. So it is very important. We have to understand that God uses people with the knowledge that they had, and he uses them to bring the people and to reach out to the people and share his salvation with them. This is the task that Hosea also had. So God used the knowledge of Hosea, the knowledge that he had, to lead the people towards salvation. And this is the important theme of the book of Hosea. So Hosea itself means salvation. So God uses knowledge to bring the people into the salvation of God. Let's look into the division of the book. Hosea chapters 1 to 3, we see Hosea's marriage to Gomer, his wife, unfaithful wife, and then the birth of his children. Then we see about God and Israel, how the relationship is between God and Israel. Then we have Hosea chapter 4, verse 9 to chapter 9. Here we see Hosea condemns Israel's unfaithfulness in worship and politics. So Israel was unfaithful in everything, in religion, in social life, in politics also. The third part we can see Hosea chapter 9 verse 10 to chapter 13 verse 16. It is a review of God's merciful dealings with rebellious Israel in the past. And the last chapter is chapter 14. It is a call to repent and about the future hope for Israel. So this is about the book of Hosea. Let's enter into the book of Micah. Okay, so Micah or Micah, as you wish to say, we have very less information about this book or this prophet. Uh, apart from what is mentioned in chapter 1, verse 1, we do not have much information. So he is from the country of Moresheth Gath, okay, which is southwest of Jerusalem. So he belongs to the southern kingdom. As Micah came from the countryside. Okay, he comes from the countryside, rural side, not urban side. So he comes from the rural side, a rural background. So sees things from an agricultural perspective, agricultural point of view, and we see that is where he especially sees, or he can see the sins, social sins on farmers by the wealthy. So he can see the differences, how the farmers and the poor were being exploited by the wealthy people. He sympathized with the farmers and the shepherds and the small stockholders or small holders like Amos did, because Amos himself was also a farmer and a shepherd. Okay, so Mika also sympathized with them because he comes from a similar background. So he was not influenced by the pomp and the show and the facade of the new urban culture. Which was actually a symbol of, which actually was symbolized by fine houses. The urban part was, they had fine houses, and there was fashion, and there was quick money business, and there were lucrative jobs over there. So he was not influenced by them, but he was more into this countryside life, and he liked that, and he could see the the bad things that were happening with them. So he was a very grounded person. He was grounded with the moral and the ethical realities, that ethical realities of a country, the moral realities of a nation that make a nation truly great. So he was not about the superficial things, but he was talking about the grassroots level, the important things of life of the nation. So he prophesied to the southern kingdom. So he belonged to the southern kingdom, and he prophesied to the southern kingdom between 750 to 686 BC during the reigns of Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. Hence, he was a contemporary of Hosea and Micah also for a while, not for a long time, but for a while. Then we see that the first two marks of a genuine prophet can be seen in the chapter 1, verse 1 itself. Let's look at the division of the book. Micah chapter 1, verse 1 to chapter 2, verse 13. We see the exile and restoration, definitely of the northern kingdom. Then we have Micah chapter 3, verse 1 to 5, verse 15. It is talking about Judah's fall and restoration. Okay, then we have Micah chapter 6, verse 1 to chapter 7, verse 20. This is the concluding indictment, lament, and promise. So this is about the book of Micah. It's not a very long book, and this is the major chunk that is found in the book of Micah. Okay, now let's move to the last book of this of today's class. That is the book of Jonah. Jonah is a story that we all know. We have studied probably many times and heard many times about him. So we'll just quickly look into the book of Jonah. The book relates to the prophet Jonah's successful mission in Nineveh, the capital of the enemy of the northern kingdom. So Nineveh is a capital of Assyria, and it was the enemy of the northern kingdom, and we know that it took Israel into captivity also. So it is very different. This book is very different from the other prophetical books because it is a story of prophet himself. Okay, this is the story of prophet himself, but this is told in a third person, and it is not a collection of any kind of prophecies apart from one oracle, which is found in chapter 3 verse 4. That is 40 more days and Nineveh will be overturned. That is the only oracle found in the whole book. The rest is all a narrative or the story of the prophet. So the story concerns Jonah's reluctance to be God's messenger to the enemy nation. Okay, he did not want to go to Nineveh or Assyria and prophesy over there, and hence he runs away in the opposite direction. Though he had to travel through the sea and double the distance, he runs to Tarshish. But God calls him back, and Jonah's resultant unhappiness is very much visible in towards the end of the book, as the ministry was very successful, but he was not happy. Nothing apart from this book is known about Jonah the prophet, which is found in chapter 1, verse 1, and the second Kings, chapter 14, verse 25. And he's identified over there as the son of Amittai. Okay, his father is Amittai. He belongs to Gath Hefer near Nazareth in Galilee. Okay, the book has been interpreted in various ways. Some call it as an historical book, some call it as allegory, and some call it as a parable. So it is interpreted in different ways. So the many scholars believe it in different ways. So if Jonah wrote the book, probably it would have been around the 8th century BC. Some scholars suggest that it was written after the exile. Okay, after the exile, in reaction to Nehemiah and Ezra's strong ethnic bias, because they were against Syria at that time. So the use of Aramaic words also probably prove to this. So the geographical details given in the book about Nineveh, like 3 days journey in breadth, chapter 3, verse 3. Okay, it talks about probably of the greater Nineveh. Okay, not just the shore part, but it talks about the greater Nineveh, the greater part of Nineveh. So some say that Jonah could not have been swallowed by a whale or a great fish. And some say that it is impossible that a fish can or a whale can swallow a human being. Uh, God controls nature. We have to understand that in the whole story of Jonah, we see God controlling the nature so many times and using it for his purpose to be fulfilled. Though there was nothing that God went against the nature to do it, but he controls the nature and he used the nature for his own purpose. So, two important words that we have to note over here are about the great fish. So there is no word as whale. Okay, there is no word as whale in the book, but it is great fish. Okay, great fish, which is dag. Okay, dag. Dag is in the Hebrew, it was called dag, which means great fish, which actually means provision. Okay, it actually means provision. It doesn't even talk about great fish, but it talks about provision. So God provided a great fish for Jonah to be swallowed by it. And then we have the next word, that is peleg. Peleg is for prayer. This is a prayer of introspection. So we see that probably Jonah was in a habit of introspecting himself and praying, and we see that he was praying in this manner, that he was introspecting his act, but still he was not repenting. That's a different story. Okay, but did this really happen, that Jonah was swallowed by this great fish? So this is something many scholars debate upon even today. But there are many stories, as we can say that in a recent past, we can see that a blue whale actually swallowed a man. Okay, he swallowed a man, and when this blue whale was cut open, a man was found inside it, and he was bleached. His skin was bleached due to the digestive juices of the whale's stomach. Okay, and his skin had turned startling white, and he was glowing. His skin was glowing because his skin had become bleached. Okay, so some scholars even try to say, based on this situation, that did Jonah actually look like this man, where his skin was also bleached completely white and it was glorious and glorified. And that is why when he went and spoke the message of repentance, the people of Assyria accepted it. Who knows? Okay, we do not know. That all is not mentioned in the book. So then we see that the message of this book, what is the message of this book? The main message of this book is that God cares for all the people of the world. Okay, God cares for all the people of the world, not only the Jews. So though Jonah was upset, though he thought that how he would go, he felt ashamed, and how he would go back to his people saying that I ministered unto the Assyrians, our enemy, and they repented. So he was facing with all those guilt, and he was ashamed of himself. But for God, all the world is his people, and he cares for all of them. It's not only for the Jews. That's what the message of the book is. But we have to understand that Israelites failed to understand this, and they did not share the knowledge of God with the other people, and they tried to keep it with themselves as if God was only their property. Okay, so this was something which was not good. Let's move on, look into the division of the book. So, Jonah 1, chapter 1, we see that Jonah's flight from God. Jonah's first call to be prophet in chapter 1, verses 1 to 2. Then Jonah runs away from God, and then we have Jonah swallowed by God by a big fish. The second chapter talks about a psalm of thanksgiving. Then the third chapter, we see that Jonah's successful mission to Nineveh. Jonah's second call to be a prophet, and Nineveh's response, that is a positive response. And then the fourth chapter, that is the last chapter, we see that Jonah's disappointment with God's rebuke. So Jonah was disappointed when his ministry was successful and the people repented, but God rebuked him. So Jonah's response to Nineveh's deliverance is also seen over there. And there is a final dialogue between God and Jonah, which is mentioned in chapter 4, verses 6 to 11. Okay, so this is all that we have for today's class. And these are the 4 books that we have studied today. The rest of the other books we are going to study in the next 2 classes. Okay, God bless you. Take care.